I'm Mara Collins, 31, and the night my brother tried to put me in my place still lives in the walls of my grandfather's Beacon Hill townhouse. The family gathered around that long mahogany table while rain rattled the old windows like fingers on a drum. Evan stood straightening his tie, a slick stack of charts under his arm, and that familiar boardroom smile set like stone. Our aunt and uncle settled in with practiced cheer cousins, trading looks that told me I was the evening's agenda. I felt the weight of every portrait in that dining room, all those faces from another time, watching as if they knew what was coming. The silver hummed when forks touched plates, but no one was really eating. Evan cleared his throat, and the room leaned toward him as if drawn by a wire. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for the first strike. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to hold your ground when someone underestimated you, tap like and subscribe so we can keep each other company through it. I was raised on steady rules and small courtesies, the kind that ask you to look people in the eye and mean what you say. My mother loved a simple table set just so, and my grandfather Walter believed a person's word ought to fit like a well-made glove. We grew up in a modest, two-family gray house a few miles from Beacon Hill, the kind with creaky floorboards you learn by heart. Money wasn't loud there, but kindness was. Evan and I both learned to hold doors, to clear dishes, to say thank you. Before the urge passed, though, the world took him more seriously from the start. When Evan shot through school with debate trophies and summer internships, the family clapped long and loud. He was the voice in every room, the shiny resume that made relatives lift their chins when they spoke his name. I was quieter, drawn to places, porches, stairwells, old parlor rooms more than platforms. Property called to me like a puzzle waiting for patient hands, and I worked my way into managing small rentals, fixing what was broken, and learning how to keep homes steady for people whose lives weren't. It never sounded impressive when someone asked what I did. They wanted headlines, not hinges that didn't squeak. Beacon Hill was its own world, narrow streets that keep secrets and brick stoops that remember every footstep. When I first started helping with leases nearby, I noticed how different it felt from our old neighborhood. Money in Beacon Hill doesn't shout it, whispers from polished banisters and careful paint. I learned to read these quiet signs the way a tenant asks about pipes in winter, the look a contractor gives when a wall hides something tired, the timing of inspections you don't want to miss. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was sturdy, and I liked how it made me useful without turning me into a spectacle. Grandpa Walter kept a study that smelled faintly of leather and tea, and sometimes he'd call me in with a nod rather than words. He'd unroll a set of floor plans like a map of a place we could both see, and we'd talk through them the way some folks talk through weather. He didn't praise much, but when he did, it came low and certain, the kind of praise that doesn't need to echo to count. He favored a slow hand over a showy one, and I carried that with me, even when I learned that a slow hand can be mistaken for weakness if you let the loudest voice define the room. As Evan climbed through the corporate ranks, our family dinners started to feel like presentations with appetizers. He'd share numbers and trends, and our Aunt Pauline would beam at him as if the candlelight were meant just for his face. The cousins learned his style, their jokes bending in his direction like grass in a steady wind. I kept to my lane, nodding where it fit, offering help where I could, and tucking what I knew about leases and city rules into the quiet place where it belonged until a better time. I didn't spend my days chasing the next big title. I spent them making sure heat came on in January, that no one waited too long for a repair, that a good tenant never had to fight alone for something basic. Noah, my assistant, came along later with neat folders and a clear eye for details I might have missed when phones started ringing at once. We worked out of a small office with a view of a church steeple and the tops of sycamores, nothing fancy, just enough light to keep our heads clear. It was a life built carefully on purpose, and it was mine. That night in the townhouse, the rain set a rhythm while Evan laid his charts beside the candlesticks, and I could feel the table holding its breath. Aunt Pauline shifted bracelets, chiming, and Richard studied the grain in the wood, already bracing for whatever would follow. Kara and Dana exchanged a glance that landed on me with a soft wince, as if they were sorry and entertained at once, while Blake and Mason settled into the kind of silence that makes room for someone else's decision. Evan placed his palm on the paper like a pledge. He lifted his head, and the easy smile he saves for clients slid into place as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. He said he had an update on the rentals and a plan to keep pace with the neighborhood, and a few nods gathered across the table like early raindrops before a storm. I watched his eyes move from cousin to cousin, then fix on me with a calm. He wears the way some men wear a watch, an accessory that tells time and status all at once. The room quieted enough to hear the radiator hiss, that old house doing its best to stay warm. Evan pulled the first chart forward and drew a neat line with his finger, speaking of numbers and fairness, and how everyone benefits when rules are applied evenly, though his gaze never left my face. I felt my shoulders ease back and settle, not with fear, but with a steadiness learned from years of keeping homes upright in bad weather. The candles quivered just slightly as a draft worked the edges of the room, lifting a corner of the nearest page like it wanted to turn itself. Evan took a breath meant to carry the whole room along with him. Then he leaned closer to the microphone of our attention, ready to make an example of me. The candlelight caught the edge of Evan's smile as he clicked his pen against the table, the sound sharp in the hush. After reviewing the Beacon Hill market, he began his tone all business. "I've realized we've been too generous." His eyes met mine before scanning the room. "Starting next month, Mara's rent will be $9,000. The number hung there heavy and unreal. Aunt Pauline's eyebrows shot up, and Kara covered a laugh behind her glass. The air thickened as forks paused halfway to plates. Evan leaned back in his chair, clearly savoring the shock. "It's time to be fair," he added, tapping his chart where bold lines climbed upward. "Market value has changed. Family or not, we all contribute." I could feel everyone's eyes slide toward me, waiting for a reaction. My pulse slowed instead of racing. The rain outside had turned to a fine mist against the windows, soft but constant. I folded my napkin carefully, placed it beside my plate, and looked at him without saying a word. "You can't expect handouts forever," Kara said lightly, as if repeating something she'd heard before. Blake snickered, and Mason gave a quiet nod, more out of habit than conviction. Uncle Richard stared at the candle, like he was hoping it would burn through the tension for him. Aunt Pauline sighed, half pitying, half satisfied. I recognized the rhythm of it all. Evan spoke. The family agreed. That's how it had always gone. He pointed to another page, pretending not to notice how the room had turned into an audience. "We can't keep pretending rent from 10 years ago makes sense today. $3,000 a month was a gift," he said, his voice dripping with a teacher's patience. "Mara, you've had a good run, but you need to stand on your own now." The word gift rolled around the table like a bad echo. My chest felt tight, but my face stayed calm. "9,000, I repeated, quiet enough that only those closest to me heard. He nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. "9, he said, and that's still under market." He glanced toward the others. "I could easily charge 12 in this neighborhood." Pauline gave a soft chuckle. "She's lucky you're keeping it in the family," she said, lifting her wine. Evan smiled like he'd just proven something noble. I looked at the rain streaking down the glass and let the sound fill the spaces where anger might have gone. For years, this kind of scene had been the background music of my life. Evan standing taller, the family nodding, and me pretending it didn't sting. When we were kids, he'd correct my math at the dinner table just to hear everyone laugh. When we were teenagers, he'd charm teachers while I stayed after class, cleaning up paintbrushes from art club. Even when we grew older, nothing changed. My work never seemed big enough to count, no matter how steady it was. After college, I'd started managing small properties around Boston, quiet buildings with character and endless repair lists. The job wasn't glamorous, but I loved the balance of order and imperfection. Grandpa Walter had once told me real estate was about patience, not polish. People mistake steady hands for slow minds, he'd said one afternoon, measuring sunlight through the study window. "Don't let them rush you, Mara." When Grandpa passed, the family named Evan executor of his estate. It made sense on paper. He was the successful one. He took charge of the Beacon Hill townhouse and every family decision that came with it. He liked the feeling of control, the applause that followed. I didn't argue. I was the one who handled repairs when pipes froze or leases expired, the quiet work behind his glossy updates. It never bothered me to be in the background until that night. Evan's words about being a parasite landed harder than the number itself. It wasn't just about money. It was the way he looked at me as he said it, as if he were stripping something invisible away. Around the table, laughter sputtered and faded. I saw Dana shift in her chair, uncomfortable now that the line had crossed into cruelty. Uncle Richard cleared his throat, but the sound dissolved in the silence that followed. I took a slow breath and reached for my phone under the table. My thumb moved across the screen, one quick message to Noah. Now. That was all I needed to write. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and lifted my gaze, letting the quiet stretch until it felt like part of the furniture. Evan mistook my calm for surrender. He went on talking about balance sheets and family fairness, about how hard it was to manage properties in the city. Each word floated past me like a rehearsed speech. He didn't notice Aunt Pauline's polite smile tightening, or the way Kara's fingers drummed on the table trying to find a rhythm to break the silence. When I didn't speak, Evan pushed harder. "You always said you wanted independence," he said, turning another page. "Consider this encouragement." He folded his arms, satisfied. I nodded once, the way I might when a tenant tells me they've lost their keys, but swear they didn't. Noah's reply buzzed against my leg. I didn't look. I didn't have to. He knew what to bring, and he'd be here soon. Evan was still talking, but the words started to blur. All I could hear was Grandpa's old clock in the hallway ticking steadily, as if marking the countdown to something long overdue. I let my eyes drift to the family portraits on the wall, Walter as a young man, stern and sure, holding the deed to this very house. I wondered what he'd think of this gathering, of the way his legacy had turned into a competition for pride. The thought steadied me. I felt something uncoil in my chest, quiet and certain. Evan flipped his last chart and smiled the kind of smile that waits for applause. "That's the plan," he said, setting his pen down with a flourish. "Starting next month." He looked at me again, expecting tears or maybe a plea. Instead, I adjusted my chair and folded my hands. "You finished?" I asked softly. He frowned, thrown by the calm in my voice. "Yes," he said. "I think that covers everything." The sound of rain had softened outside the storm, easing into drizzle. Then, from the porch came the creak of footsteps. The front door opened, and every head turned. Noah stepped into the room, his shoes leaving faint prints on the old hardwood. He carried a black folder under one arm and met my eyes briefly before looking toward Evan. "Ms. Collins," he said evenly, "you asked me to bring these." The chatter that had been building around the edges of the table died all at once. Evan's pen rolled off the table and clattered against the floor. "What is this?" he asked, his voice thinner than before. Noah didn't answer. He set the folder beside my plate and stepped back. I reached for it slowly, the air in the room so still I could hear the clock in the hall again. "Thank you, Noah," I said. He nodded and turned to leave. Evan stood half out of his chair. "You couldn't have picked a worse time for theatrics," he snapped, but his voice wavered. I flipped open the folder. Papers, signatures, seals. Every page was familiar. My heartbeat steadied as I turned the first one toward the light. "Evan," I said, my tone. "Even I think you've misunderstood something about this house." His color faded, his confidence draining faster than I'd ever seen. Aunt Pauline covered her mouth, whispering to Richard, who leaned forward to see the header on the page. The room fell silent, caught between disbelief and curiosity. I let the pause linger just long enough for everyone to feel it. Outside, a single car passed on the wet street, its headlights flickering across the dining room wall like a ghost of something ending. "Would you like to read it?" I asked, sliding the top document toward him. He hesitated, eyes darting between the paper and my face. The man who'd just lectured me about responsibility couldn't seem to find his words. Around us, the family stayed perfectly still. Even the radiator stopped its soft rattle, as if the house itself were listening. Evan reached for the folder, his hand trembling. The edge of the deed caught the candlelight gold seal glinting faintly. I watched his expression shift from confusion to realization. His jaw tightened. "This can't be," he started, but the words trailed off. I leaned back, the same calm in my voice that had unsettled him from the start. "It's all notarized," I said quietly. "Everything's in order. The air seemed to change in that moment, the way a room feels right before thunder. No one spoke, not even the cousins who'd laughed earlier. Evan lowered himself back into his chair, the papers still in his hands, his eyes darting over every line as if reading might rewrite them. I folded my napkin again, slower this time. "Maybe now," I said softly, "we can talk about fairness." The clock in the hall ticked once, twice, and then the chime began. It was old and low, the kind of sound that settles deep in the bones of a house. Evan didn't move. No one did. And in that stillness, I knew the night had only just begun. Evan's fingers hovered above the folder, his expression locked somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The soft shuffle of paper filled the silence as he scanned the first page, his lips moving just enough to form the words he didn't say out loud. Aunt Pauline leaned forward, clutching the edge of the table as if she needed it to steady her. Uncle Richard adjusted his glasses and glanced at me, his brows drawn. The cousins stayed still, their faces pale under the amber light. I didn't rush him. The house was quiet except for the rain tapping lightly against the window panes and the low hum of the radiator. Every breath felt heavier than the one before. When Evan finally looked up, his eyes darted between me and the document in his hand. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice uneven. I met his stare, calm and steady. "From the county registry," I said softly. "Everything you've been managing for the family these past few years, the leases, the repairs, the contracts, they've all been under my ownership." His mouth opened, then closed again, as if his mind couldn't find the next word. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Grandpa left the house to the family." I shook my head once. "He left it in trust until his attorney completed the sale. That sale happened 3 years ago, through my company." The words were gentle, measured, but they seemed to drain the color from his face. The folder lay between us like a stone dropped in water, the ripples spreading through every person in that room. Aunt Pauline covered her mouth, whispering to Richard, who only sat back and sighed. Kara's fork slipped from her hand, the sound sharp in the stillness. Dana glanced at me, then quickly looked away. "You can't mean—" She began, her voice trailing off when she saw my expression. I turned another page toward Evan, the deed at the top bearing both the LLC's name and my signature. "You've been managing my property, Evan," I said quietly. "Not the family's." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Blake's uneasy laugh broke the silence. "This is some kind of joke, right?" he said, looking around the table. No one joined him. Evan straightened in his chair, his tone suddenly louder, sharper. "You forged this," he snapped. "You had help. You can't expect us to believe you pulled this off without." I slid the folder closer to him and pointed to the notary seal at the bottom. "Everything's verified," I said. "Attorney records, witness signatures, transfer receipts. You can check them yourself if you'd like." The confidence in my voice wasn't something I planned. It was just there, the same way quiet strength fills a space when noise finally fades. Evan looked down at the papers again, then back up at me. The flush in his face deepened, and his hand trembled as he reached for his glass. "You blindsided me," he said under his breath, more to himself than to me. "All this time—" His words broke apart before he could finish. I leaned forward slightly, the steady warmth of my tone unchanging. "All this time," I said, "you thought you were helping me. I let you believe that because it kept the peace. But it doesn't change the truth." He pushed back in his chair, the legs scraping against the floor. This is unbelievable," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. The cousins exchanged nervous glances. Aunt Pauline muttered something about misunderstandings, her hand fluttering near her pearls. Uncle Richard stayed quiet, watching the two of us, as though he'd known this conversation was waiting for years. Evan finally threw the folder onto the table, the papers sliding out like fallen leaves. "You're lying," he said again, but his conviction was fading fast. "You can't just—" He stopped when he noticed the letterhead at the bottom of the deed. The name Hart Holdings, LLC gleamed faintly under the chandelier light. He recognized the name. It was a tribute to our grandfather, one he couldn't argue with. "You used Grandpa's name," he said, his voice a whisper now. "He would never have I cut him off," my words calm but clear. "He gave me the means to do it, Evan, and he made sure I'd know how. I just kept my promise." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the faint hiss of tires on wet pavement. I could feel the weight of every look around the table, each one searching for where to land. Evan's hand tightened around his glass until the ice inside clicked softly. "You're not serious about this rent thing," he said finally, his tone brittle. "You wouldn't actually—" $18,000 a month, I said evenly. His head jerked up. "That's the current Beacon Hill rate for your unit," I continued. "Effective immediately, 30 days' notice. Just as you planned for me." Kara gasped. Blake sat back, shaking his head in disbelief. Dana whispered something under her breath that sounded like, "Oh my God!" Aunt Pauline's fork clinked against her plate. Evan stared at me, speechless. "You can't do that," he said after a long pause, his voice cracking. "It's not legal." I turned to Noah, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, and he stepped forward, pulling out a single-page document from his briefcase. "Month-to-month tenancy agreement," he said, handing it to me. "Signed by Mr. Collins here." Evan's name was printed neatly across the bottom, his signature in familiar blue ink. Uncle Richard adjusted his glasses again and murmured, "She's got you there, son." Aunt Pauline shot him a look, but she didn't say anything. I kept my eyes on Evan. "You set the rules," I said quietly. "All I've done is follow them." The room stayed frozen, the only sound the faint hum of the clock in the hall marking each second that passed. Evan's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked smaller, less certain. He glanced around the table, searching for someone to speak up, but no one did. Even Blake, who'd always mirrored his confidence, avoided his gaze. "You can't afford that rent, can you?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and his eyes shifted toward the window where the city lights blurred behind the glass. "You make good money, but after taxes, the car, the travel, the dinners—" I let the sentence drift away. The rest spoke for itself. Aunt Pauline broke the silence first, her voice too high. "Mara, surely there's a middle ground here," she said. Family should respect each other." I interrupted, my tone still calm. "I'm not asking for anything more than that." She looked down at her plate, her cheeks flushing pink. Evan rose abruptly, his chair scraping back hard against the floor. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "You can't just walk in here and Evan," I said softly. "You're standing in my house." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sentence hung there between us, final and unshakable. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and strode toward the door without another word. The others stayed seated, their eyes following him until the sound of the front door echoed through the hallway. When the noise faded, I exhaled slowly and looked down at the papers still spread across the table. The family sat in uneasy silence, the warmth of the candles fading into cool air. Aunt Pauline started to gather her things, murmuring about needing to get home before the rain picked up again. Uncle Richard gave me a small nod as he rose, his expression unreadable. One by one, the others followed their footsteps, soft against the old wood floors. When the house was finally quiet, I walked to the window. The city lights glimmered against the slick pavement below, and in the reflection I could see the long dining table behind me empty now, except for the papers, and the faint glow of the candles burning low. Noah stepped beside me, his voice steady. "You did what you had to do." I nodded, my eyes still on the street outside. "It's only the beginning," I said. The air in the house felt lighter somehow, though I knew the storm wasn't over. Far from it. Outside, a new sound rose, a train's distant horn echoing across the Charles River, and with it came a quiet certainty that the balance of our family had shifted for good. I didn't know what Evan would do next, but I knew the silence that followed would not last long. The house was quiet after everyone left, the kind of stillness that settles only after tension has burned itself out. I stayed by the window watching the lights fade across the Charles River until they disappeared into the fog. The folder sat on the table behind me, its edges curling in the candlelight. The papers were simple ink signature seals, but they carried the weight of everything Grandpa Walter had ever taught me. Evan's shock still echoed in the room like a voice that hadn't found its ending. I remembered the day Grandpa called me into his study a few months before he passed. He sat in his worn leather chair, the one that always creaked when he shifted, and pointed to a stack of old property ledgers on his desk. "You've got the patience for this," he told me, sliding one open. The pages smelled faintly of dust and cedar. He traced a finger over a line of numbers explaining how each decision, each repair, each lease told a story about the people who lived there. Real estate isn't about buildings, he said. It's about time. Whoever understands time wins. At the time, I didn't know he'd already made his choice. After the funeral, when the lawyer called, I sat alone in a small office downtown and listened as he read the letter Grandpa had written just for me. His voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the affection hidden between the words. Grandpa had left me $1.5 million money he'd saved quietly through years of ownership and careful planning. It wasn't meant for comfort, it was meant for work. Use this to build something, the letter said. Something that lasts. I kept the secret close. I didn't tell Evan, not even when he started managing the townhouse and bragging about running it like a business. I let him handle the surface details, leases, maintenance calls, emails, while I studied everything beneath it. I spent late nights going through zoning maps and permit archives, learning what it really meant to own in Beacon Hill. I wasn't chasing prestige. I was building a foundation that no one could take apart. When the time came, I formed an LLC under a neutral name, Hart Holdings, as a quiet nod to Grandpa. The process was tedious meetings with attorneys, bank appointments, tax forms, but I felt grounded in every decision. A few months later, I made the purchase through that LLC, the same townhouse my brother believed was still part of the family's shared estate. I didn't tell anyone, not even Noah, not at first. Noah had joined me around that time back when I managed smaller rentals and handled most of the repairs myself. He was sharp and organized with an instinct for details that made him indispensable. When I finally told him about the townhouse, he didn't say much, just nodded and asked how he could help protect the paperwork. We kept everything off the family's radar. Evan stayed blissfully unaware, proud of his position as manager, sending me updates that only confirmed how little he understood the structure behind his job. Now standing in Grandpa's dining room years later, I could almost hear him again, steady, practical, never one to waste words. Let them underestimate you, he'd say. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means ready. Evan had taken advantage of that quiet for years. Every family dinner had been another chance for him to polish his image while letting everyone believe I lived on his charity. I remembered one summer barbecue when he'd raised a glass to himself, joking that at least one Collins knew how to make money. Everyone laughed. Aunt Pauline even clinked her glass against his, calling him the responsible one. I'd smiled back then the way you do when you've learned to survive mockery without showing the bruise. In the months leading up to that disastrous dinner, I'd started to feel the gap between us widening. Evan's company had been struggling quietly, though he never admitted it. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he'd lost a major account and had been using the family's praise as his last safety net. When he called that meeting, I knew it wasn't about fairness or business sense. It was about control, about reminding me and everyone else where he thought I belonged. That's why I'd sent the text to Noah the moment Evan said the word parasite. I didn't do it for revenge. It was just time. The documents had waited long enough. Later that night, when I finally left the house, the streets were slick and shining under the lamplight. Boston's old brick buildings held the smell of rain and cold stone. I walked home without an umbrella, the air sharp enough to clear every leftover piece of doubt. By the time I reached my apartment, Noah had already texted. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in the kitchen window that overlooked the alley behind the townhouse. The quiet of the city before dawn always felt different, lighter, honest, in a way daylight never was. I turned on my phone to find a string of missed calls from Evan, each one shorter and more desperate than the last. I didn't call back. I opened my laptop instead and reviewed the property files. Every record was in order. Every payment, every tax, every signature lined up exactly where it should. The security of it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhale. That afternoon, I visited the office where Grandpa's lawyer, Mr. Henry, still worked. He was older now, his once dark hair turned completely silver. When he saw me, he smiled knowingly and motioned me into the same chair where I'd sat years earlier. I heard things got interesting, he said, his voice dry but kind. I nodded, setting the folder on his desk. It's done, I said. He knows. Mr. Henry adjusted his glasses and studied the documents, flipping through each page with deliberate care. "Your grandfather would have been proud," he said quietly. "He liked to plan 10 moves ahead." He looked up at me. "You've done the same." I thanked him, but words felt small. As I left the office, I realized I hadn't thought about pride at all, not once. I just felt the peace that comes from no longer needing to prove anything. That evening, I walked past the townhouse again. The front steps were wet with drizzle, the porch light glowing faintly against the dark. From the sidewalk, I could see the parlor window where Grandpa's portrait used to hang before Evan had moved it upstairs. For a moment, I imagined him there again, hands folded, that slight smile that never quite reached his eyes. Time he'd said once has a way of showing you who's been listening. The truth was, I'd been listening all along, while everyone else measured success by noise and numbers. Grandpa had measured it by steadiness, by how long something could last once the talking stopped. I hadn't built my life around applause or attention. I'd built it around that lesson. When I turned to leave, I noticed a light still burning on the top floor. Evan's penthouse windows glowed faintly behind the curtains. He was still there for now. 30 days wasn't long, but it would be enough. I didn't need to wonder what he was thinking. He'd realize soon that the rent increase wasn't a punishment. It was simply the truth catching up. The rain began again as I reached the end of the block, soft at first, then steady. It blurred the outlines of the buildings and softened the edges of the night. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward home, the city lights reflecting off puddles at my feet. Behind me, the townhouse stood quiet, its old bricks gleaming under the rain. Grandpa's house. My house. And somewhere inside, the echo of every lesson he'd left behind waited for the next chapter to unfold. By the time I reached my door, my phone buzzed again, a single message from Noah. "Evan's been calling the office. Should I respond?" I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Not yet." The storm outside deepened, the wind brushing against the windows like the start of a new conversation. I knew Evan wouldn't give up easily. He never had. But the difference now was simple. For the first time, I wasn't standing in his shadow. I was standing on my own ground. Evan didn't show up at the office the next day, but his silence spoke louder than any argument could have. The following morning, his number appeared on my phone 5 times before I even finished my first cup of coffee. By noon, he had switched to text messages, each one shorter than the last. "We need to talk. Then, you can't be serious about the rent. Finally, please don't do this in front of the family." I didn't respond. I forwarded the messages to Noah, who flagged them and filed them away. For 2 weeks, I focused on the work that never stopped: inspections, lease, renewals, new tenants moving in, and old ones moving out. Life moved in small, predictable circles, and I kept mine steady. But late one Thursday, as I locked up the office, I noticed Evan's car parked across the street. He sat behind the wheel, staring down at his phone. I waited a moment before walking over. He rolled down the window halfway. The confident brother I'd known was gone. The man in front of me looked smaller, worn around the edges. "You won," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the steering wheel. "Congratulations." I shook my head. "It's not about winning, Evan. It's about being fair." He gave a dry laugh. $18,000 a month is fair." His voice cracked thin with disbelief. "You know I can't pay that." I leaned down slightly, keeping my tone calm. "That's the market rate for the unit. You use that same logic with me." He exhaled hard, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. "You didn't have to make it public," he muttered. "You humiliated me." The word hung there between us. I didn't answer right away. The streetlights flickered on, casting gold across the hood of his car. "You made it public," I said finally. "You called that meeting, remember?" He turned away, jaw tightening. "I was trying to teach you responsibility," he said. "You made me look like a fool." I straightened. "No, Evan," I said softly. "You did that yourself." Then I stepped back and walked away before he could respond. The next morning, Noah stopped by my desk with a stack of envelopes. "These came in early," he said. Among them was one from Evan, a cashier's check for the old rent amount and a typed note clipped to it. "Please reconsider. Let's handle this privately." I slid it into a folder marked pending eviction and nodded to Noah. "File it," I said. Over the next week, word spread quietly through the family. Aunt Pauline called first, her voice soft and sugary. Mara, dear, surely there's been some misunderstanding. Evan's always been good to you. Maybe you could find some middle ground?" I listened without interrupting. "Aunt Pauline," I said when she paused, "middle ground is what I lived on for 10 years. It's time for balance." There was a long silence on the other end before she murmured, "Well, I hope you know what you're doing," and hung up. Uncle Richard reached out next, stopping by the office unannounced. He carried a grocery bag with muffins and that quiet patience that made him the only family member who never joined in the teasing. He sat across from me unwrapping one of the muffins like he needed something to do with his hands. "You've got every right to stand your ground," he said after a while. "I just don't want to see this tear everyone apart." I nodded, appreciating his tone. "It already did," I said gently. "I'm just setting things straight." Evan's resistance didn't last long. When the 30 days passed, he sent one final email short, polite and stripped of the bravado I'd grown used to. "I'll be out by Friday." That was it. No apology, no accusation, just surrender in 12 words. On the morning of his move, I stood at the window of my Beacon Hill office and watched the moving truck pull up to the curb. Evan carried out his own boxes, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, the crispness gone from his usual posture. He didn't look up once. Noah joined me at the window, handing me a fresh coffee. "Do you want me to go check the unit after he leaves?" he asked. I shook my head. "Give it a day. Let him go in peace." We both watched as Evan closed the truck door and climbed inside. The engine rumbled, then faded down the street. That afternoon, I walked through the building floor by floor, checking locks and mail slots. The penthouse door stood open just enough for me to push it gently. Inside, the space was bare, except for a single lamp on the floor still plugged in. The air smelled faintly of cologne and dust. I crossed the room and looked out over the rooftops of Beacon Hill. The view hadn't changed, but the feeling had. For the first time, the house didn't feel like someone else's stage, it felt like home. I called Noah from the doorway. "Start listing the penthouse at full rate," I said. 18,000, no exceptions. He hesitated for a second. "Even for family," I smiled faintly. "Especially for family." That weekend, the rest of the leases came up for review. I spent hours at my desk drafting renewal letters, 10% increases for most tenants' fair adjustments for the market. I wasn't cruel, just consistent. Uncle Richard's rate stayed untouched. He'd earned that grace through quiet decency. Pauline's, though, increased the full amount. The cousins who'd laughed loudest at that dinner got their notices too. None of it felt like revenge. It was simply math and respect in equal measure. By the time the final letter was sealed, I leaned back in my chair and glanced at the old photograph of Grandpa Walter on my bookshelf. He was younger in the picture, standing on those same townhouse steps, a faint smile on his face. "You'd have done it the same way," I murmured. A few days later, I got an unexpected call from Dana. Her voice was soft, careful. "Mara, can we talk?" she asked. I met her at a coffee shop near the Common. She looked nervous, stirring her drink even after the ice had melted. "I just wanted to say—" She hesitated. "We were wrong about the way we treated you. None of us thought you'd well that you were—" She stopped again, searching for the right word. I finished it for her. "Capable." She gave a small, guilty nod. "You were always the one Grandpa trusted. We should have seen that." I didn't reply right away. The cafe was quiet except for the sound of spoons against ceramic. When I finally spoke, my tone was even. "It's not about proving anything, Dinah. It's about respect. That's all I ever wanted." She nodded, eyes glassy, and whispered, "You have it now." That night, as I walked home through the narrow Beacon Hill streets, the lamps cast long shadows over the brick sidewalks. The townhouse glowed softly at the end of the block, every window reflecting the amber light. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after storms, not empty, but calm. When I reached my door, I paused and turned back once more. I thought of Evan somewhere outside Boston, settling into a smaller apartment with walls that didn't echo his pride. I thought of the family learning that fairness wasn't something to fear, and I thought of Grandpa's words, the ones that had carried me through every moment of doubt. "Play the long game. Time always tells the truth." The clock inside the house chimed 8, its sound steady and familiar. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the echo soft and certain. What came next wasn't about triumph. It was about peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop apologizing for taking up your rightful space. The first sign that the fallout had reached beyond family came quietly. One Monday morning, Noah stepped into my office holding a thin envelope. "You'll want to see this," he said, setting it on my desk. The letter was from a company I recognized, the same marketing firm where Evan worked. It wasn't addressed to me directly, but to Hart Holdings, LLC. They were terminating their contract for managing a small Beacon Hill property under Evan's portfolio. No explanation, just a polite closing line about restructuring priorities. I leaned back in my chair, reading it twice before setting it aside. Evan's choices were starting to catch up to him. News traveled fast in our circles, and by then, the story of that family meeting had reached more ears than I cared to count. Someone, most likely one of my cousins, had shared a filtered version online. All I knew was that the truth had a way of traveling faster than excuses. That evening, I walked home through the narrow streets, the air sharp with early winter. The townhouse looked steady in the lamplight, its brick walls catching the last shimmer of daylight. For years, it had felt like a symbol of control that didn't belong to me. Now it simply felt like history standing firm through every change. The next day, Evan called again. This time I answered. His voice was quiet, almost hoarse. "They pulled one of my accounts," he said. "Clients saw that post and started asking questions. You didn't have to make this a spectacle." I kept my tone level. "I didn't," I said. "You did that when you brought family business to a dinner table." There was a long silence on the line before he spoke again. "Can we meet?" he asked. "Just the two of us." I agreed, mostly because it felt like the right step forward. We chose a cafe halfway between my office and his apartment, a neutral place, nothing sentimental. When I arrived, Evan was already there, sitting near the window with a coffee that had gone cold. He looked tired, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. "You made your point," he said when I sat down. I didn't answer right away. The hum of soft jazz filled the quiet between us. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said finally. "You treated me like a burden, and I stopped letting you." His eyes flickered toward the window. "It's not that simple," he said. "You have no idea how much pressure I'm under." I folded my hands on the table. "Maybe not," I said, "but pressure doesn't give anyone the right to humiliate someone else." He didn't argue. The silence stretched until it softened. He finally nodded, slow and heavy. "I shouldn't have called you that," he said. "Parasite." The word came out brittle. I was angry, but that doesn't excuse it. I let his words settle before answering. "I appreciate that," I said. "But apology or not, what's done is done. We can start over, but only if it's honest this time." He nodded again, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I just want this to stop defining everything." For the first time, he looked less like the brother I'd known all my life, and more like the boy who used to sit with me on Grandpa's porch steps, counting the number of cars that passed before bedtime. Maybe that part of him had never really left. It had just been buried under pride and expectation. When I left the cafe, the air outside was colder than before. I walked past the old brick storefronts, their windows glowing with early evening lights, and felt a strange calm that didn't come from winning or being right, just from knowing where I stood. The following week, I met with my attorney to finalize the rent adjustments for the other tenants. Everything was clean by the book fair. Uncle Richard's lease stayed untouched, just as I'd promised. Aunt Pauline's increase went through along with Kara's and Blake's. There were murmurs, small comments passed between cousins at gatherings, but none of them confronted me directly. I think they understood now that silence was safer than another attempt to put me in my place. One afternoon, as Noah and I reviewed documents, he glanced up from his desk. "You know, he said you could have just sold that townhouse and walked away with a small fortune." I smiled faintly. "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about keeping something built on the right kind of hands." He nodded understanding without needing more words. That evening, I took a walk to the river. The wind coming off the water was brisk, tugging at my coat. I thought of Grandpa again, how he used to talk about the long game, how patience was worth more than pride. I'd spent years mistaking quiet for weakness. Now I knew it was a different kind of strength, the kind that lasts when everything loud burns out. A few days later, Aunt Pauline invited me to Sunday dinner at her house. I almost declined but decided to go. When I arrived, the atmosphere was subdued. The same cousins who'd once laughed too easily now greeted me with careful politeness. Evan was there too, seated at the far end of the table. He looked different, less polished, more grounded somehow. Dinner passed with small talk and stories about work travel weather. No one mentioned the townhouse. When dessert came, Evan stood and cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he began. Everyone went still. "What I did to Mara was wrong. I let ego get in the way of family." His voice didn't tremble, but it wasn't rehearsed either. "She's earned everything she has, and I should have respected that." No one spoke for a long moment. Aunt Pauline dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Uncle Richard gave a quiet nod. I didn't move. Evan looked at me, his expression open, waiting. I met his eyes and simply said, "Thank you." After dinner, as people gathered their coats, Evan approached me by the doorway. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just wanted to set things right." I nodded. "It's a start." He smiled faintly, the first real one I'd seen from him in years. Walking home that night, the air felt lighter than it had in a long time. The narrow Beacon Hill streets glowed under the street lamps, the cobblestones slick with mist. I passed the townhouse, pausing at the steps before heading up to check the mail. There was a small envelope tucked beneath the door, a new tenant application for the penthouse full rate with references attached. Inside the house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of Grandpa's old clock. I set the envelope on the table and stood by the window, watching the city lights blink through the fog. The skyline looked softer somehow, as if the whole city had exhaled. Noah's text arrived a few minutes later. Lease signed. Penthouse ready by next week. I smiled at the screen, typed a short reply, "Perfect," and set the phone down. Outside, a thin layer of frost had begun to form along the railings, glinting in the lamplight. I thought about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The house still stood where it always had, but its story finally belonged to someone who understood what it meant to build rather than to boast. When I turned off the lights and started up the stairs, I caught one last reflection in the hallway mirror, the faint outline of my grandfather's portrait on the wall behind me. For a second it looked like he was smiling. I didn't stop to be sure. I just kept walking one step at a time into the quiet that waited upstairs. By Thanksgiving, the chill had settled deep into Boston streets, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. The townhouse windows glowed with soft light as the family gathered again, just like every year. But this time the laughter was quieter, the glances longer. I could feel the weight of everything that had changed resting just under the surface. Evan arrived late, carrying a pie box that looked too small for the apology it represented. When he stepped inside, Aunt Pauline greeted him with that careful cheer she used when she didn't know which side to stand on. "You made it," she said, her voice a touch too bright. Evan smiled politely, then looked across the room at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Dinner started the way it always did, people passing dishes, sharing small stories, pretending old wounds didn't still ache. The roast turkey sat in the center of the table, like a peace offering no one trusted yet. Evan took the seat across from me, where Grandpa Walter had once sat, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel smaller under his gaze. Halfway through the meal, Aunt Pauline raised her glass. "To family," she said softly, her eyes darting between us, "for staying together no matter what." A few murmurs followed, uncertain but polite. I lifted my glass too. "To honesty," I said. "It's a harder thing, but it lasts longer." Evan's eyes met mine again. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that didn't need words. When dessert came, the cousins drifted into the living room, their voices low, cautious. The room had lost its old sharpness. No one was laughing at my expense anymore. Even Kara, who used to tease me the most, offered a small smile as she poured coffee. "I heard you filled the penthouse already," she said. "That was fast." I nodded. "Good timing. The new tenant's a writer. Quiet pays on time." Kara's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Guess the place is in better hands now," she said. Evan stayed at the table long after everyone else moved away. He stirred his coffee without drinking it. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You did well, Mara. The way you handled it. You were right." I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the steam curl above the cup before I answered. It wasn't about being right, I said quietly. It was about not being erased. He looked down, nodding slowly. I spent years thinking I was helping you, he said. Turns out I was trying to help myself feel bigger. I glanced at him, the flicker of candlelight catching on the curve of his face. He looked older, not just in the way people age, but in the way they change when pride finally lets go. After dinner, we stood in the hallway by the old portrait of Grandpa Walter. Evan studied it for a long time. He believed in you, he said, almost to himself. I used to think he favored you just because you reminded him of Grandma, but now I think he saw something I didn't. His tone wasn't bitter, just honest. I let the silence hold for a moment before replying. He saw what we could both be, I said, if we stopped trying to win against each other. Evan's shoulders dropped a little. I'm trying, he said quietly. I know I have a long way to go. I gave a small nod. Then start there, I said. That's more than enough. He smiled faintly, the tension between us finally softening into something closer to peace. As people began gathering coats and leftovers, Aunt Pauline cornered me near the doorway. You've turned that building around, haven't you? She said. It's practically worth a fortune now. I smiled politely. It's not just about the money, Aunt Pauline. It's about keeping something that matters. She looked surprised for a moment, then nodded, adjusting her scarf. You've grown into quite the woman, Mara, she said softly. Your grandfather would be proud. When the last of them had gone, I walked upstairs to the study where Grandpa's old desk still sat. The air smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I opened the top drawer and found the worn envelope with his handwriting for when the house feels heavy. Inside was a single note I'd read 100 times. Hold steady. Time will show you the rest. I traced the words with my thumb, the ink fading but still strong. Outside, the snow had started light and quiet. From the window, I could see the city stretching wide and glowing beneath a thin veil of frost. Down below, the lights in the townhouse flickered warmly against the cold, like the house itself had chosen to forgive. Later that night, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, the old clock ticking steadily beside me. My phone buzzed a message from Evan. Thanks for letting me come tonight. Then another. I'll start the new job next week. Smaller firm. Feels right. I smiled faintly, typed back a simple reply. Good luck. You'll do fine. The fire cracked softly, the warmth filling the room. I thought about how far things had come, the rent increases, the family tension, the years of being overlooked, and how somehow the quiet had found its way back. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The house felt alive again, not because of who used to run it, but because of who it had allowed me to become. I took one last look at Grandpa's portrait, the way his eyes seemed to follow the light. It's all in order now, I whispered. The wind outside brushed against the window panes like an old song, steady and sure. Somewhere beyond the snow, I could almost hear his voice again, soft, patient, and certain. Play the long game, Mara. Time will tell. The words lingered long after the fire dimmed, a promise carried quietly into the night, leading toward the life still waiting ahead. Winter carried on quietly after Thanksgiving. The snow came early that year, blanketing Beacon Hill in soft white that muffled the noise of the city. From my office window I could see the rooftops glittering under the streetlights, the same streets where I used to hurry past with my head down. Now when I looked out, I saw something different. I saw home, not just a place, but a life finally standing on its own feet. The townhouse had settled into a rhythm again. The new tenant upstairs paid on time and kept to herself, and Uncle Richard still stopped by once a month for coffee and a quiet chat. Aunt Pauline sent a Christmas card that smelled faintly of her expensive perfume, wishing me continued success, her handwriting smaller than usual. Even the cousins softened, sending short texts now and then, tiny olive branches that I chose to accept. Evan didn't come around much, but every so often, an email would arrive about a property lead or a repair contact, written with a polite tone that used to seem impossible for him. It was enough. Noah and I finished year-end reports in the office one evening as the snow started again. He looked up from his computer and said, "Hard to believe it's been a year since everything changed." I smiled. "Feels longer," I said, "like we've lived a few lifetimes in between." He grinned, closing his laptop. "Worth it, though." I nodded. Every lesson usually is. When I left the office that night, the streets were nearly empty. The city lights reflected off the fresh snow, turning the cobblestones silver. I walked slowly, letting the quiet sink in. There was a peace in knowing I'd done what needed to be done, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. For the first time, I understood what Grandpa meant when he talked about legacy. It wasn't about buildings or money. It was about standing tall in your own name and leaving something behind that couldn't be undone by anyone's pride. At home, the heat clicked on, and the familiar hum filled the rooms. I made tea and sat by the window watching snowflakes drift past the street lamp. Grandpa's photograph hung above the desk, the same faint smile in his eyes that always seemed to know more than he said. I found myself whispering, "You were right, Grandpa." Time did the talking. A few weeks later, Evan called. His voice sounded lighter, steady, in a way I hadn't heard in years. He'd settled into his new job, smaller firm, better balance. "It's humbling," he said with a small laugh, "but good for me." I could hear the honesty in his tone, and that alone was something I'd hoped for. Before hanging up, he added, "You were right about a lot more than I gave you credit for. Thank you for handling things the way you did." I didn't answer right away. The only thing that felt right to say was, "I'm glad you're doing better." After the call, I stepped outside onto the porch. The city was still the kind of quiet that only comes when snow absorbs every sound. I thought about everything that had happened, the meeting that started it all, the years of silence before it, and the moment I finally stopped shrinking myself just to keep the peace. I had learned that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's just the calm refusal to be pushed out of your own story. The townhouse behind me glowed softly in the cold, its windows warm against the dark. It had once been the symbol of everything I couldn't claim. Now it was proof that patience and preparation matter more than applause. I didn't win anything that night at the family table. I simply took back what was already mine. I've learned that justice, when it's real, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it unfolds quietly through time and truth, until even the people who doubted you have no choice but to see you clearly. That's the kind that lasts, the kind that doesn't need to be repeated to be remembered. I turned back toward the house, closing the door behind me, the lock clicking softly into place. The air inside was warm and still, the scent of cedar lingering from Grandpa's old desk. I looked around once more, the room steady and sure, every corner a reminder of how far I'd come. And maybe that's the real ending, not victory, not revenge, but peace. Knowing that I didn't need to prove myself anymore. I just needed to live the life I built. Before I went upstairs, I poured one last cup of tea and stood by the window as snow began to fall again. Slow, quiet, endless. It covered the street and softened the edges of everything it touched. If you've ever had to fight for your place in the world, I hope this reminds you that you don't have to do it by shouting. You can build, you can wait, and one day the truth will stand on its own. And if this story stayed with you tonight, take a moment before you go leave a thought, share a memory, or just breathe in the peace of knowing you made it through. Sometimes that's the truest kind of justice there is,